Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to you all. And prepare yourselves for what I'm certain will be a thoughtful and engaging session on the craft and art of biography. Was it Oscar Wilde who called biography the new terror of death? Or did he steal that from George Eliot? No matter who said it first, if the remark holds any validity at all, meet three absolutely terrifying people. And look at them, how frightening they are. To be serious, the members of this panel all share a gift that isn't often found among their fellow practitioners. To the very points of their scalpels, they know how to do this most difficult thing. They know how to separate the objective truth from the subjective opinion. And therefore, and thereby, when we're reading them, they instruct us to do the same and how to do the same when making our judgments. First, in the center, by the way, note unconsciously, note how orderly they are. They arrange themselves alphabetically. Atlas, Morris, Nasaw. I didn't tell them to do that. These are people accustomed to assembling facts. First, Sylvia Jukes Morris recently completed her gigantic, in every sense, life of, well, a giantess, the never less than astonishing Claire Booth Luce, in two substantial volumes, in every sense, Rage for Fame and The Price of Fame. Ms. Jukes Morris, she writes with just an exquisite sense of profound nuance. When you meet a writer who takes a nuance and you suddenly know there are levels in there that you sink down beautifully into, you know you're in the presence of an absolute master. And over you'll find that Sylvia can, in a brief sentence, she can convey a large swathe of her subject's emotional scaffolding. For example, I just plucked one example. This is one sentence at the end of a paragraph. Unrequited love, in her case, Claire's case, was the kind most likely to last. How can you not read on? And we sit back and consider, and we shall, I assure you, discuss. James Atlas has the credentials, the energy, and some of the trajectory and the work traces of the great John Aubrey. And while Mr. Atlas has immortalized the poet Delmore Schwartz, he has also added to the immortality of Saul Bellow in a book which the usually restrained and often dismissive economist called, and I quote, a judicious, admirable, vivid portrait of a complex, gifted, and sometimes exasperating man. I have a hunch we might be homing in on the word exasperating. David Nasaw seems to have specialized in giants of one kind and another. Joseph Kennedy Sr., father of a dynasty, or dynasty, as I'm reluctantly learning to say. William Randolph Hearst, the real Citizen Kane. And Andrew Carnegie, who gained my eternal love by decreeing that all libraries must have steps outside them because we should ascend to learning. And of whom Mr. Nasaw wrote this. This is wonderful. Andrew Carnegie's decision to give away all he earned set him apart from his contemporaries. Here's the point. It also paradoxically encouraged him to be even more ruthless a businessman and capitalist. That's probably a definition of personal freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your panel. Please make them feel welcome. Here's our format. I shall fire questions at each of the three individually to begin with. Then we shall engage in, I hope, loose colloquy, and then you'll be free to ask questions from the audience. And when it comes to asking questions from the audience, I shall direct you very precisely in how to ask the questions from the audience, as some of you who were at yesterday afternoon's session may wincingly remember. Let me start with Sylvia. Many of the questions that I ask here will be asked so that they don't need to crop up in our discussion later. But The first question I think that anybody must ask you when they meet you on the proverbial bus, train, or jet aircraft, why Clare Boothe Luce?
Well, that's a good question because many biographers, I think, would agree with this, that in some ways you don't choose the subject, they choose you. And in my case, I was looking for another subject after I'd finished a book on Edith Roosevelt. And I kept a file of people that I find interesting. And I opened this file, and some papers fell to the floor. And I picked it up, and it was an interview with Clare Boothe Luce that took place in 1973 when she was in New York for a revival of her play, her most famous play, The Women, on Broadway. And the New York Times had interviewed her at great length. And as I read through, I realized why I'd kept this particular article, because here was a woman who'd understudied Mary Pickford on Broadway, had starred in an Edison movie at the age of 13, had married a millionaire at 20, had one child, had then divorced him and married Henry Luce, the famous publisher of Time, Life, and Fortune. She became a congresswoman and subsequently an ambassador. And as I read on, I thought, my goodness, this is the woman of the century. Who accomplished as much as this in as many fields? 3 Broadway hits, all made into movies. So in a way, you see, the subject had found me by accident because I was so hooked reading that article. There was no doubt in my mind that she was the subject.
And then?
Of the next book. So the next thing, of course, she was still alive. I had to approach her to get permission because her papers in the Library of Congress were larger than most presidential collections. She knew she was going to be famous from childhood, so she kept every scrap of paper. There were every letter from her mother at the age of 4 or 5 and things like that. So I knew that that was going to be a formidable task. But also, I had to get her permission because the collection was at that time closed until sometime when she thought she might be dead. She actually wasn't when the time came, but that was the idea. So I had to write her a letter. At that time, she lived in Hawaii. And I didn't get a reply to the first letter. So 3 months went by, so I wrote again. And she wrote back and said I was a very persistent young woman. And she said, I'm disinclined to write a biography because my personal life, I have a biography written, my personal life has been so unhappy. So I wrote back again. I said, well, we know we don't have to dwell on the personal life, being a little disingenuous there, because that's the most interesting part of anybody's life, is the personal. So anyway, finally she said, well, I'm coming to Washington, we'll have dinner, and blah, blah. So we did, and it was at the house of the Librarian of Congress at the time, a man called Daniel Boorstin. And so finally she did agree to it, even though at that dinner it didn't seem to be going well. But I better shut up now.
When you met her, can you describe the first moment you saw her and then met her?
Well, it was by accident in a way, because after I found the papers on the floor, I had 3 phone calls. The first one was from a woman in Washington called Lucky Roosevelt, who was giving a dinner party. And she said, I'm giving a party, want to come down? And it's in honor of Alistair Horn, the great historian, British historian. And I said, well, who else will be there? And she said, well, Clare Boothe Luce will be there. She said, but if you come, she won't take any notice of you. She didn't know I was thinking of this book, because she's only interested in men. Well, I go, and it's true, she doesn't take any notice of me until the end of the evening. When she's leaving, she gives me a big kiss. And I thought, she's mistaken me for the hostess, who was also short and dark. Anyway, that was the first meeting. Not all that auspicious, but...
Tell us what she was like. What was her presence like?
Well, she had the kind of charisma, to use a rather cliched word now, but if she walked in right now, all eyes would go to her. She had a presence. She wasn't all that tall, but she seemed tall because the personality was so overpowering. She was only 5'5", but she felt like 6'5" to me. She was a dominating sort of presence, but in a quiet way, because she was very soft-spoken. And she had tremendous wit. That was another thing. And so seductive that even at the age of 80, when I gave her 80th birthday party in Washington, D.C., the columnist Richard Cohen was there, who wrote for the Washington Post. And she collared him after dinner and took him to a secluded part of the sitting room. And at one point I looked over and she was stroking his hair and his beard. I thought, Claire, you've had too much to drink. But afterwards he came up and he said, Christ, he said, the only 80-year-old I've ever wanted to jump into bed with. So she kept that aura about her, that seductiveness. She was a highly potent sexuality because she was so beautiful. Lovely complexion and beautiful blonde hair and always very erect. So,
as the sands of your Clara Booth-Luce time settle, what is the one, this is an unfair question, what is the one single fact or thing or anything about her that stays most in your mind?
I think it was her humor. She was so incredibly witty. Her one-liners were just left you speechless. One of my favorites is the difference between an optimist and a pessimist is that a pessimist is usually better informed. So all of her lines had some profundity to them, even though they were funny at the time.
James Atlas. Immediately I have to make this observation that the two subjects for which you are most renowned, Delmore Schwartz and Saul Bellow, weren't exactly great people with one-liners, were they? They weren't a barrel of laughs.
Oh, Delmore had all kinds of one-liners, like, what does old age avail but the best seats at the funerals of friends? Or, I lie in the coffin of my character.
Yeah.
Very funny.
Saul Bellow. What attracted
Modern.
you to him, apart from the fact that he was, at the time you were writing about him, still one of the most powerful authorial figures on the planet?
Probably that my mother, who used to ride on the subway with him to Northwestern, didn't think he was as cute as everyone else did. That always stayed with me. But I did think, and continue to think, that he was the great American novelist of the 20th century. It was incontrovertibly. And when I first read his books at the age of 14, starting with Dangling Man, the first two books that he called his PhD, his MA and his PhD, I was just instantly seized with the power of it and the authority and the amazing capacity he had with words. Bernard Malamud was a family friend of ours, and when I gave him a galley of Humboldt's gift in 1975, he called me up at 8 o'clock the next morning and said, he has 3 words to every one of mine. He had that incredible fecundity and energy. But, and then there was also this biographical side, because I'm from Chicago, and I'm from that world, and not only my mother, but all kinds of people that I knew traversed the same world that he did, and I was fascinated that such a great writer should turn out to be writing about a world that I knew intimately, the world of Chicago Jews in the early 20th century, and wanted to know more about it. It was just a piece of tremendous good fortune.
He came to Writers' Day, Penn Writers' Day in London once, and after a very interesting performance in which he berated a photographer, who was the official photographer there, criticized the theme of the conference, and in general showed himself less than affectionate. I approached him afterwards for an interview. He said to me loftily, "As you will know if you have read any of my books, I have very little to say."
I didn't know that. I knew there were other conflicts at that conference, however, insulting V.S. Naipaul and so on.
Does that, well, maybe that might not have been such a bad career choice either. Was there anything in his being that suggested that he felt he had little to say?
Well, on the contrary, he felt, and he was right, unlike most people, that he did have everything to say, and that it was his job, as he called it, his line of work, his business, to describe reality as he experienced it. Not only was he a great novelist, but he was a great essayist, so that he wrote about the period, the politics of the period. He wrote about what I think is the great phrase, crisis chatter, this idea that we're all being swept up, even more so now, by this kind of distracting discussion of trivial and transient issues while missing out on the great issues of the day, great metaphysical issues.
How would you summarize his view of the human condition?
Wow, you really ask tough questions. His view of the human, there were two parts, I get, well, there were many, of course, but one you would say that he was the human condition, alone, entirely. Whatever Saul Bellow's condition was the human condition. So he saw the world very, very much through the lens of his own experience and sensibility, which was perhaps a limiting quality in him. But he also was, I would say, quite pessimistic, really. He had great fits of exuberance, as he called them, but when it really came down to it, he was, the idea of mortality ruined the whole thing.
David Nasaw, you don't stand on the shoulders of giants. You don't follow in their footsteps. You stand slightly to one side and view them sometimes with a very beady eye. Why figures of such stature? Why did you choose them?
I am a historian who writes biographies. Historians write about all sorts of things. There are many subgenres. I write about characters who Zelig-like are everywhere and nowhere in American history and in global history. I wrote about Andrew Carnegie because I was fascinated as a historian in trying to figure out what happens to the American people, what happens to sensibilities and sensitivities in the Gilded Age, in the age of the Industrial Revolution, when more money is made faster than probably ever before in the modern world. And Andrew Carnegie was this extraordinary character for me. I choose characters who are, as I said, everywhere. Carnegie was, he lived on both sides equally of the Atlantic Ocean. He was the Star-Spangled Scotsman. He was an industrialist. But more than that, he was a philanthropist and a peace activist. Hearst, I wrote about, it was my first biography, and I wrote about him in the age of Ross Perot. Everybody remember Ross Perot? Ross Perot was going to change American politics forever because he was camera friendly. He was, no one could quip. They didn't call them sound bites then, but he was a genius at sound bites.
And some of them were unconscious. When interviewing him once, I said to him, what do you want to happen in this election campaign? He was, what, 5'4"? He said, I want the American people to look up to me.
Yeah. Well, the pundits believed that because he had all the money in the world, he was going to make a huge difference. And I wanted to look at politics and culture, politics and the media. What better way than to look at William Randolph Hearst? And again, Hearst, who had the largest media empire in the nation, the greatest ambition, and wanted to be president. He was also a movie producer. He was a true bigamist. He was a progressive who became a reactionary.
And yet endorsed the man from Princeton for president, Wilson?
He certainly does. But he's also a man who employs at one point Hitler, Mussolini, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Bertrand Russell to write for him.
David, was there any one moment
Yeah.
in his young life that you would say was the making of Hearst?
Rosebud.
Terrific question.
Right.
Was there probably when his mother said to him, his father died leaving gazillions of dollars. He expected he would get enough money to set himself up in business and in life. And his mother said, consulted with family lawyers and family friends and put together a trust fund for him. So he didn't come into his inheritance until he was in his mid-40s. So he had to prove to himself and to his mother and to the world that he was not just another rich, spoiled kid who didn't do well at Harvard.
And then there was Joe Kennedy.
Joe Kennedy,
Amen.
I had written, I wanted to write about with Carnegie, I had gone, Carnegie and Hearst, I had gotten into the 20th century, into the mid-20th century. Kennedy, I wanted to take the next step. And again, I wanted to look at a man who was a self-made billionaire who founded a dynasty and who went from Boston politics to Hollywood, to Wall Street, to the New Deal, to Washington, to Palm Beach, and at every step of the way, as you said about Clare Boothe Luce, he would walk into a room, no matter who was in the room, all eyes would turn to him. And everything he did with an eye on his fortune, with an eye on his legacy, but more than that, with an eye on his children and their success.
One last brief question in this section. How accurate is it to say that his own, not always internalized tyranny produced serious fragility in every one of his children? Would you say that was accurate? Because John Kennedy was extremely frail physically and had been since childhood. Bobby had a distorted personality, some would say, that there was some problem with every one of the children. Was that the father's fault?
I would say I would put it in the opposite way. I would say, how was it that this man produced this extraordinary family of achievers? The women, as much as the men, when you look at the women, and when you look at what Eunice Shriver did, and when you look at Ambassador Jean Kennedy Smith did, and when you look at even Pat before her disastrous marriage and problems with alcohol, I think this is an extraordinary family. And I think they succeeded despite the physical ailments that some of them had. So I would put my emphasis on the achievements. I would put my emphasis on the achievements that go from top to bottom of the family, including the women. And that's the question that, that I was taken with. How did this happen?
Right. Let me ask each of you now the same question. I warn you, it's a lousy question.
Thanks a lot.
I don't answer.
What will you not put in a biography that you have discovered? What discovery, what kind of discovery will you not put in a biography? Sylvia.
One you can't authenticate. It's based on gossip and not facts.
Suppose it is authenticated.
But if it's authenticated, in Clare Boothe Luce's case, she kept masses of documents which were not favorable to herself. Letters from people that were insulting, letters that she wrote that were far from flattering to her. So I think that would be my criteria, because I think human life, are we to say what's most interesting, what's most despicable, whatever, you have to paint a rounded picture. And the more faults a character has, really, the more the reader will identify with them, actually.
James?
So.
Yes, 2 quick points. This idea of authentication is very important, I think, because when we're writing our biographies, we have been, or some of us have been, willing to take the word of one source, one witness, and then that person, that then becomes a story. It's not as if we're writing for the front page of the New York Times, but I still now have come to believe, toward the end of my career, that you really can't do that, that you really have to have other ways of verifying a story that you tell or quote. The other is that many years after I finished my biography of Saul Bellow in 2000, I came across a manuscript by a girlfriend of his who had known him for 50 years. And I read this. It was absolutely extraordinary. She was the person who knew him best in the world, and I had only known her for one footnote. But it turned out that she was really the essence of the story. So it doesn't invalidate my book, but I was just fascinated to realize that whatever you put in is very much accidental, and that I would have, if I had it to do over again and it had this manuscript, I would have put in a tremendous amount of it, even though it's quite graphic. And, it tells the story.
I was going to say one more thing. I asked Claire Luce why, since she was such a great writer herself, why she had never written her memoirs. And she thought about it. She said, well, she said, how could I tell the truth about Harry? That was her husband. And then she thought again, and she said, well, when you think about it, autobiography is nothing but alley-biography. In other words, it's very hard to write about your own faults.
Ah, that's revealing. David, if authenticated, is there ever anything you won't put in?
I'm interested, again, as a historian, I'm interested in the public figure, the public life. If there are parts of the private life that contradict the sayings or the persona that's built up in the public life, then I'll deal with it. If there are parts of that private life that have no bearing whatsoever on that public figure, that historic figure, that individual in history, then, you know, I don't care. I don't care. If I were writing about John Kennedy, I would spend much more time talking about the sexual escapades. Writing about Joe Kennedy, because it was compartmentalized in such a way that it did not have the same effect, his sexual escapades, on his historic life, on his public life, on his life as a historical figure. It didn't seem to me, I mean, it's there in the book, but it's not a major theme.
If he'd been in the White House, though, as his son was, you think it would have been more important to talk about it? Because he risked a great deal.
Yeah, I think if I were talking about Jack, absolutely.
Can I ask you this question? If writing fiction and you create a protagonist, you have to be inside that protagonist's mind, or else you take a different position. You're outside observing the protagonist. To what extent do you live, no, where do you live with your main subject when you're writing about them? James.
Are you asking for an address? As far away as possible.
What is the distance?
It's something that you have to really be very cautious about, because if you begin to say, which I've never done in my life, he probably felt, or he thought, or that just isn't possible.
We've all read those biographies.
Yeah, so you can't know that. But I think, on the other hand, there does come this sense, after many years of occupying, inhabiting that person's head, where you do actually know what they're thinking and what they're feeling. You just can't say so. But I think that what you really want to be is in that place where you can use the information and data that you have in a much more confident way.
Well, what develops? Is it a concern? Is it to be extreme? Is it a love? Is it a subjectivity? Does that ever develop?
Well, you hope that there's enough love to propel you through the project, and enough skepticism to make you independent. And beyond that, you just reach a point, don't you think, where you as somebody wrote me once, it was as if you were more familiar with him than he was with himself. That's where you really want to be. That was with my first biography.
Is that how you characterize it?
There are two dangers, actually, in writing about anybody's life. And the one is that you fall in love with the person, or the other side of the coin, where you come to hate them. you shouldn't write the book in those two cases. You should give it up. Because really, you're not there to judge them. You're there to tell their story. And what you have to really develop for them is a sort of mild affection and tolerance, too. And otherwise, I don't think you should
Like a
do
distant
it.
relative,
Like a distant relative.
so to speak.
It's hard to do, of course, when you know the character, when they're alive. That's the problem.
I remember
And,
Victoria Glendinning telling me once that when she was writing a biography of Anthony Trollope, she began to become so inquisitive about him. She wanted to know everything.
Yeah.
In your case, you had no problem with that because everything was in the documents.
It was, yes.
But did you develop a separate inquisitiveness?
Yes, because, you know, the way I found out where Claire was telling less than the truth was when I asked a question. For example, I was in Hawaii with her once, and I spent 3 weeks there going through her personal documents. And a very attractive woman came to dinner with a very unattractive man. And I said to her afterwards, I said, are they the same age? Because it seems such a big disparity. And she said, oh, no, you know, she had the facelift. And I thought, here's my chance for the facelift question, which I hadn't had chance
After
to
30 years.
30 years. So I said, well, of course, you never needed one, did you? And then she looked down. No. She said, but when your book comes out, I'm going to go up to Bloomingdale's and sign copies. I didn't have the heart to tell her it's usually the author who signs the copies, not the subject. But but I saw at that moment when she looked down, and it happened on a couple of other occasions, she lied. She couldn't look at me when she told a little lie or an untruth of some kind.
I'm getting a sense that there's a strong argument running here that it's the biographer's job to be more truthful about the subject than the subject has been.
That's true. Yeah.
I remember once Bella was telling me he was a genius, okay, so he's a genius. But he would look me in the eye and tell a lie, and I never knew what to do.
You knew the facts.
I didn't start that
You knew the
funeral
facts.
on a cruise ship. It was later. What am I supposed to say? Yes, you did, and I have the documentation right here, buddy. You have to let it go.
So David, has that been, but because you also have another weight on your side, you have the weight of history, which is an even further burden of truth.
Yeah, well, I am absolutely delighted, and when I listen to my fellow panelists, I'm even more delighted that I've never written about anybody who was alive.
Yeah.
I've never had, not only have I never written about anybody who's alive, but the time differential has always been that most of their wives, friends, business associates are also dead. I do not like to, I'm a friendly, sociable guy, but the last thing I want to do is interview people. And I stand in awe of those of you who can interview people and get something out of them. I would much rather look at documents. I would much rather look at letters. I would much rather look at transcripts of other people's interviews, where you can turn the page if you get bored, where you can fast read, where you can skip through, where you can direct your attention to where you want to direct your attention. So I think I'm delighted by that. My rule always is to remember that I am not God in heaven. I am not a judge. I'm not a prosecutor. It's not my job to say guilty or innocent, evil or good. I'm not a moralist. I'm not a religious figure. As Sylvia said, I have to tell a story. And I want it to be the story that aligns most closely with the historical record, with what is known about this person in this time. But it is a story.
But given power as a starting point, given world influence as a starting point, given a mark upon history as a starting point, is there any subject that you, the historian biographer, the scientist biographer, if you like, would find too repellent? Would you, for example, have written a biography of Hitler?
No, I could not, absolutely not have
Tell me
written
why not.
No, when I begin, because I want to remain enough of a distance to tell the story without feeling the need to condemn.
So there is an emotional component, potentially.
I don't know that it's, and I don't know whether I would use the word emotional. There is a component. I have to keep enough of a distance to be able to tell that story, number one. And if you totally dislike, hate, detest an individual, then it is nearly impossible to maintain one's sanity and the sanity of one's family if you spend 5, 6, 7 years with someone you can't stand. The most important thing for me is that I've been fascinated by these people, that they do things that I love, that they do things that I don't much like, but that they always surprise me. And a character who didn't surprise me, and who I couldn't live with for 4, 5, 6 years, would not be an appropriate subject.
Which speaks to your earlier point.
Well, I was thinking that the rogues are actually much more interesting. If I had the choice between writing about a saint and a rogue, I'd choose the rogue every time, because I think you can reach that point where they are so roguish or so outrageous, like a Hitler figure, that you're almost sympathetic. You think, how could this monster have been created? How did he get away with this for so long? Why didn't somebody bump him off? You know, you don't have to really say, I don't like Hitler. That's sort of a given that you don't like what he did. But I think how he got there is the most intriguing thing.
But of course, there's also the wonderful possibility that the saint might really be a rogue.
That too. And they have been. St. Augustine, for example, started out as a libertine.
Oh, God, send me chastity, but please don't send me
Not
death.
yet,
Yes.
no. Exactly.
Do you ever get the sense, though, your subject will be about to do something that you know he's about to do because you're his biographer, and you feel like saying, don't do that. You want to change the narrative. You want to intercede
before they make a
ruin your
misstep.
story.
Yeah.
I think one of the grand 20th century political biographies is Ian Kershaw's 3 volumes on Adolf Hitler.
Yes,
Yes.
there
It is
you
an
go.
absolutely magnificent,
Magnificent.
Yes,
book.
it is.
And I do not know how he was able to spend his lifetime with Adolf Hitler. But more power to him, because it could be done. And he did it, and he did it magnificently.
Let's talk about something that I personally find attractive, which is there must be a moment in a biography that suddenly tells you, this is why I do this job. This thrill, this rush of adrenaline. Speak to it, James.
That is a really interesting question, because you struggle along in the dark for years. I remember this, my fellow moment. He was, to be as brief as possible, because I know you're very demonic about time, but
Not so demonic, not so demonic.
He was in therapy 4 times, and the 4th therapist was Hans Kohut, who was really one of the great thinkers in modern psychotherapy and created the idea of the self-object. But Bello was not going to tell me that he had seen Kohut, and I didn't have any verification for this. So I finally thought about how can I do this? It's sort of like it's the facelift. The facelift routine.
Yeah.
I was sitting in the parking lot of a Jewel food store in Chicago with him while his wife went in to buy groceries. And I said, so what was Kohut like? And by doing that, I unlocked his, well, essentially, this is just shameful, but I trapped him. But he didn't really have anything much to say about it except that he had seen Kohut, so I knew he acknowledged that he had seen him a few times, and that Kohut lived in his building. It's like they met in the elevator or something. But then I went home and I read Kohut, and in the middle of the night, I was lying there on the couch in my living room reading Kohut, as I tend to do. It's weirdness of being a biographer. And there was this passage about the wound that the narcissist suffers and the incredible pain of that experience of having being that psychological type.
It's rather like you're torturing your microphone just now. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was my moment. This person is sympathetic because he suffers, and once I really understood that.
That's a central truth you discovered there.
Yeah.
In a parking lot.
Yes.
Wonderful. Sylvia, what was it for you?
I think it would have to be the day. This was before I went to Hawaii and saw all the love letters and the diaries and the personal documents. So I was going through the Library of Congress, all these boring letters from her constituents in Fairfield County, Connecticut, that kind of stuff that was deposited early on. I hadn't seen the private stuff yet, but one day she came to lunch, and this happened quite often. She would bring a little thing, instead of bringing me a bottle of wine or something, she would bring a document. on this occasion, she brought a whole diary of 1932. And that was when she was at the height of her beauty. She was managing editor of Vanity Fair at the age of 29. And she was having the time of her life because she was editing. Noah Coward would come in, P.G. Wodehouse would come in, Eugene O'Neill would come in. It was an amazing time in New York in the 30s. So this diary recorded those days. But I noticed there was a little tick, and sometimes two, at the top of some pages. And then I would look down, and it was lunch with somebody, lunch or dinner with somebody. And I realized she was ticking off the time she had slept with somebody. And, you know, in those days with contraception not being so great and all of that, she was worried, you know, she needed to know the father, I suppose, of any mishap. So that made it really worthwhile, because at that point I'd only been looking at all this miserable stuff in the...
So you had the facelift moment, and you had the uptick moment. Wonderful. David, for you, what's the moment of adrenaline?
Well, I was very thankful that the diary, because there was many ticks when Joe Kennedy visited.
Yes, exactly.
So I thank you.
They had a fair. They used to time their crossings of the Atlantic, so they were on the same boat.
Yes.
And they could have their fare. And then even when he was ambassador in London, she would show up at his country house, or he would take her to Ascot and the theatre.
Or he would visit her in Paris
yes.
a couple of times.
And you know, Joe, that one when she was at the Ritz Hotel in Paris, Joe here all morning.
Yes. Many, many takes.
I feel left out.
I just, you know, I am the luckiest, you know, I'll make a Lou Gehrig statement. You know, I'm the luckiest man in the world, not because I'm a Yankee. I would have maybe preferred to be a Yankee, but because I'm a biographer and historian, and I absolutely love it. The thrill of doing research is just the adrenaline one gets when you find something. It takes all sorts of patience to do so. Arthur Schlesinger, at the end of his life, said that the yield from research was too low for him. He spent too much time and didn't get enough, so he's never finished the last biography of his Roosevelt, or the last volumes of his Roosevelt book. I'm still at it, and every once in a while you find a document. I'll give you one example. Someone, I think Vartan Gregorian, told me that there were some papers that had been found in a bank, in a dumpster outside a bank in Hoboken. And he had given them to the archives at Columbia University. I went to Columbia University, and in the archives, CCNY archives, which I had looked past a gazillion times because I thought it was City College, it was Carnegie Corporation of New York. In those archives, I found a copy of the prenuptial agreement he signed with his wife. He signed the agreement 10 years before Homestead, when everybody loved this guy. Everybody loved Carnegie. He was the perfect capitalist. He did reading rooms for his workers. He paid them well. He met with them. This is before the big steel companies. He got married, and in the prenup, his wife says, I fully understand that my husband-to-be is going to give away his fortune to philanthropy. Item number one. Item number two, I support him in this. Item number three, I will not demand a part of the estate because he intends to give it all away. Now, boom, that one document totally rewrites the history of Carnegie's philanthropy, because it becomes clear he's not doing it out of guilt about Homestead. He's not doing it because he wants a wonderful reputation with the people of Pittsburgh. He's already got that. He's doing it for another reason, which I had to discover in writing my book. Can I give one more brief example?
Very brief.
Very brief. I had a researcher look at the Central Zionist Archives in Jerusalem, and they found there letters and minutes from a visit of Chaim Weizmann to London to talk to Kennedy. And at that conversation, Kennedy said to Weizmann, Hitler's a lunatic, but I think that I can talk him into making a deal, right? For currency, he needs American money, he needs dollars, we'll give him the dollars and he'll let the Jews go. And Washington won't like it, but I'm trying to arrange a deal to do this. And Weizmann looks at him like he's nuts. But I understood this guy. That Kennedy had been so successful as a businessman, he thought he could negotiate anything. And if given the opportunity, he was going to go, and he tried to go to Berlin to talk to Hitler and to make a deal.
Wonderful. Your turn, ladies and gentlemen. May I have the first question? Jack.
This is addressed to all three, but it has to do with something Mr. Nasaw said about telling a story. If a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and there's an arc that strings them, is that something that you actively look for? And have there been subjects at which you have not been able to find it?
Oh, was this a question addressed to you?
No.
Don't all leap forward at once.
Beginning, middle, and end.
Yes.
A good place to start is birth, actually, conveniently. And you know about the end, but the middle is more complicated. But I've thought a lot about this and about how narrative really works and how to make it effective. And I've come to the conclusion that narrative is illusory, really, that we create this scaffolding on which to hang our story. But if you really think about it and how this person evolved and lived, you have to create a narrative that's much more in their head. You can't really count on it just going chronologically, though that's a good organizing.
I would say it depends on the story, because in Claire's case, she was born in abject poverty, and it was a bit of a downer to start with all of that dreary stuff. So I started when she was really at the height of her life, the first night of the women. And the whole prologue to book one is that first night. And I did it in great detail, where she was, who was in the theater, what went on backstage, all the mishaps and things like that. And then you sort of try to hook the reader with something positive and glamorous, and then they'll take the dreary stuff that's going to come with the birth.
David? Beginning, middle, and end?
No, I love writing biographies because it is much easier to organize them. Given that, however, one has to, in different characters, one has to put different weight on different periods of life. And that is part of the skill and the craft of writing biography, to determine to what extent. I hate foreshadowing. I think the biographer should not do that. The biographer should not say, Joe Kennedy had a newspaper stand and at that moment began his quest for millions and millions of dollars. Life doesn't work that way. Nonetheless, you have to figure out whether this event in adolescence deserves 5 pages, 10 pages, or nothing at all.
So it's a chronology of the strides and the stumbles.
Absolutely.
Yes. Another question? Yes, lady here.
Hi. I understand fully not approaching a person whom you either love or hate to write a biography. But it can't be such detachment that when you're in the midst of everything, you form some sort of either distaste or affection for the person. It must be a very difficult thing to retain detachment. And how do you do that? When instinctively, you must say, well, you know, Claire Booth Luce was really a funny lady and so forth and so on. But keep your distance. How do you all keep your distance?
That's a lovely question.
That, I think that in a way is the essence of the whole business, because if you can't be sympathetic, if you can't extend sympathy toward your subject, no matter how nefarious they are, then you really have a conflict. And I confess that I wrestled with this in terms of Bellow, but I think that you have to really, let me turn it around, you have to acknowledge that you can't do that. That's what I really finally feel at the end of decades of struggling with this. It can't be done, so therefore you have to work around it and create these moments of sympathy as best you can, rather than convince yourself that you've actually done it.
And David, you have the protection of history.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if it's protection. Maybe. I work really, really, really hard, and I think what comes down to it in the end is you got to write and rewrite and reread and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. I spent, I don't know how long, on the section trying to figure out how to answer the question, is Joe Kennedy an anti-Semite? And I began by saying, well, the question is wrong. The question should be, how much of an anti-Semite was he, or what kind of an anti-Semite was he? And then I realized along the way that that's not fair to him or to history. He was an anti-Semite, okay? And yes, it's in the air, and yes, it's in Washington, and yes, it's in the State Department, and yes, it's in the Irish Catholic community that he grows up in, but that doesn't explain it entirely. And one has to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it. Books are never completed. You just stop.
Somebody said they're never completed, they're simply abandoned.
Yeah, right, Mallarmé.
But as for that, about the business of fairness, I was much younger when I began the biography, and I was much older when I finished it. And, but I found in the earlier years when I was writing, I was much more judgmental. And as I had life experiences myself as time went by, I got less so. So it was good that it took me so long to do, because I was able to go back and correct some of that feeling that might have crept into.
We have time for one last question. Ken Cooper.
Do you believe that the important personalities of our generation are leaving enough of a record for the biographers of the next generation to do as good a job as the three of you were able to do on the people that you wrote about?
What a great question.
Yeah, that's a good last
Emails,
question.
no letters.
No,
Yeah.
no, there won't be any records to speak of.
Basically, we're toast, and that's why there's a good last question.
We're toast.
But
Go ahead.
it will be different, as things are always different, Ken. You know, it's like now the next biographies we'll have video, and we'll have all kinds of other ways of mapping what a person is like, don't you think? I mean, it'll just be different, but it won't be the way we did it.
So nobody's going to come to dinner or to lunch bringing a little block
Diary?
of emails?
No, I don't think so. Unless they keep them all. They can print them out, of course, that happens. People print out important things, but they don't print out what they consider unimportant that the biographer might think extremely important. And that didn't get printed out.
What about historical documents?
It will be different. The biographer of the 21st century and the 22nd century will have different tools. Some will be better, some will not be nearly as good as ours. Letters lie, emails lie, and all documents have to be interrogated, examined.
But as we have found, biographers do not lie. James Atlas, Sylvia Jukes Morris, David Nasaw, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.